Great, John. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. I'm dialing in here from Central Florida, just to give you a sense of where I am. And it's with the advent of technology. It's great that we can all connect here, even though we're separated by some distance. And so my goal today is, hopefully to present something educational and intriguing or engaging for you guys. Obviously, plan giving is a big topic. There's a lot to cover that is beyond 1 hour, but we're going to do our best today. And I think I'm going to run through a few slides with some items that I think are sort of evergreen with plan giving, right? So we have some things that are always relevant, kind of always floating around in the atmosphere when we think about plan giving with our donors and our organizations. I'm going to hit on a few things that are more current or immediate, that hopefully, again, not something we're looking to master or totally internalize, but just some ideas and some thoughts to kind of get front of mind, top of mind for you as you're hopefully engaging more in plan giving and maybe doing some research and some practice on your own. And then hopefully, I think the most valuable part of this is to have some time to answer your questions, comments, not only directed towards me, but hopefully for the entire group can listen in, see some similarities, have some takeaways that they can bring back to the office as well. So I will do a few minutes here at the beginning of sort of a monologue, but absolutely want to make this as engaging and as much a dialogue as possible as we go forward. So let me go ahead and jump in. I'm going to share my slide deck here, and this should be coming up momentarily. Bear with me, everybody.
There you go.
Is it looking good? All right. Okay, so one of the themes I thought about for this presentation is the short-term versus long-term, right? So when we're talking about plan giving, there's a couple things I think about, one of them being assets versus income, right? So a lot of times when we're in the fundraising view of things, we're thinking about raising dollars today, we're thinking about raising dollars immediately, and we're thinking of talking to donors about giving out of their income or their, sort of year over year type giving. Plan giving has a lot of the same fundamentals, but a lot of times we're talking about giving out of assets, right? So asset pools. Sometimes those assets are difficult assets for donors in the sense of they have some tax complications around them, or they're illiquid, so they can't readily be turned into cash, or there's some other kind of complicating factor for a donor that it might make more sense for them to donate that asset to a charity as opposed to selling it on their own or giving it to a family member or what have you. So assets versus income is one thing. Immediate versus deferred, right, is another common thing, right? So a lot of times plan gifts, I'm going to make the gift now, I'm going to sign all the documents, but you as the organization are not going to actually see that gift for years to come, right? It's deferred to some future point, or deferred until there's some event that happens, right? Someone's passing or some other kind of objective event, right? So it's a little just different mindset. The other thing I want to talk about is sort of short and long term. And I came across this quote from an organization some of you may have heard of called NASA. And this quote is, "The difference between weather and climate is simply a measure of time." Okay, and I think that's relevant for plan giving, right? Where we're talking about some things in the immediate term, the weather, so to speak, of what's happening. But a lot of times we're thinking longer term, more the climate kind of conversation with not only our donors, but kind of what's going on in the economy, what's going on with legislation in Congress, all types of things are floating around in that long term. So just to kind of get a frame of reference, that's kind of a theme that I threw out there. And hopefully it helps you kind of keep things in order. I know it does for me. So just kicking off, how is the weather in 2021? Okay, I can't believe we are in 2021. We're almost 1 month down already, but want to talk about some recent federal legislation. We're not going to take a super deep dive. I know there's lots going on out there, but there are some things I think as fundraisers, as leaders of charities, as board members of charities, there are some things out there that are affecting our donor pools, both in the short term, the weather side, and potentially a little bit longer term as well. We're going to briefly talk about applicable federal rates, or the 7520 rate, 7520 in the tax code. Very important rate in regards to all types of transactions, but specifically important in regards to plain giving vehicles like trusts and other things that we'll touch on in a moment. And then finally, I'm going to go through some vehicles, attractive giving vehicles, 2021. There are lots of plain giving vehicles, ways of giving, subsets of those ways that make sense for the donor and different options and things. So this is not all of them, just some. And I think I'm picking the most common or the most likely that ones you might see in your fundraising efforts with your donor pool. All right, so let's jump in. We have recent federal legislation. I know this is very exciting, and I know everyone perked up when I said this, so bear with me. We're just gonna go through. I'm gonna highlight some things. I know some of us recognize the little bill there on Capitol Hill. I didn't get the trademark for that, so don't get me in trouble, but I thought that would be a good visual aid for everybody. Okay, so first off, the Secure Act. The Secure Act was the big piece of legislation that we were talking about right at the end of 2019. If you can remember the end of 2019, this was the big piece of legislation. Bunch of stuff in the Secure Act, but the main takeaways for most people, or at least in terms of charitable giving or its impact on charitable giving, is they raised the required minimum distribution age to 72. Okay, required minimum distributions are mandated withdrawals that people have to take out of their retirement accounts, right? So the IRS or the US Congress says when you hit age, used to be 70 and a half, now it's 72, you must start taking a percentage of your retirement account each and every year, otherwise you face a penalty. Okay, the challenging thing for that for some folks were, especially some of our higher income retirees, was they didn't need the RMD and they didn't want the RMD. Okay, so it's just they were getting more income than they wanted or needed, but they had to take it year in and year out. So one of the sort of outlets for that was the qualified charitable distribution, sometimes called the IRA charitable rollover. This got a lot of press in the nonprofit world. It's been around for a few years. And this essentially allowed folks to, in lieu of the RMD, instead of taking the RMD, they could make that a transfer or distribution straight from their IRA to a charity. They get credit for taking their RMD, but they don't actually take the income. Okay, this was very advantageous for these high income retirees. They didn't get the charitable deduction on their income taxes, which is fine because they didn't get the actual extra income. Okay, so, and I can take more questions on that. I know it can be a little bit detailed. So they kept that piece. Okay, so we have the RMD age is now raised to 72, but the QCD, the qualified charitable distribution angle, stayed at 70 and a half years old. Why 70 and a half? Who knows, but that's what it is. So right now, your folks that are 70 and a half and older don't need the RMD, don't have to take the RMD, but they can still give you a charitable gift out of their IRA. It's $100,000 per person per year maximum. So it's a nice option for those a little bit older donors who are in that situation where that might make sense for them. Okay, so that was a change. The other change, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but we used to have what we called a stretch IRA option, right? So if someone inherited an IRA from a parent or what have you, they used to be able to substitute their life expectancy for whoever the person who owned the IRA originally, the person who had since died, so they could stretch out those payments over a longer period of time. They cut that off in the Secure Act. It's a maximum of 10 years with some very limited exceptions. So I guess what I would say on this is IRAs in general are designed for people's retirements. They have some tax benefits for the person who owns the IRA during their lifetime. When that person passes, there can be some kind of sticky tax consequences for those who inherit it. So just as a general rule, IRAs can make very good charitable gifts, just generally for folks, because they have some issues now, and especially cutting off this stretch provision makes them even more complicating for, say children or grandchildren to inherit. So just keep that in the back of your mind. IRAs are, as a general rule, can be very advantageous to give to charity after the person's gone. The other piece of legislation, which we've heard, we're going to give a couple of updates here, the CARES Act. Okay, so we had the Secure Act. It came right at the end of 2019. Everybody was talking about it January and February, and then something came along, February, March timeframe. I don't know if anyone remembers that, but COVID hit, right? And CARES Act was very much a reaction or a response to the COVID pandemic kind of coming down upon us all at the same time. Obviously, there's a lot in the CARES Act. There was a couple things charitable-wise or charitable giving-wise that came out of that. It has since been extended or updated as of December, I think it was 22nd of just a few weeks ago, just less than a month ago. So the things that I think are most relevant for us on this call, last year, one of the things that came out of the CARES Act was everybody got a $300 charitable deduction, whether they were itemizers or the standard deduction or what have you. If you gave $300 out to charity in 2020, you got a deduction, full stop. That provision was $300 per, say, tax return. So a married couple filing jointly, it was one $300 deduction. They kept that into 2021, but they actually made that a little more beneficial. So now it's actually, if it's a married file jointly, it's actually could be $600. It's $300 each person. That's a little bit of a change, but again, I think it's favorable to charities. So something to keep in mind. The other thing that came out of the CARES Act, which you may have talked to some donors about last year, was they raised the adjusted gross income deduction to 100% of adjusted gross income for cash gifts. It was in 2020. They extended it into 2021 for those who itemize. So the reason this is important, and we'll get into the legislation on this in a minute, but a lot of folks, charities, we talk about your gift to us is fully tax deductible to the, fullest extent of the law, which is true. But it's only really beneficial to the folks that take the itemized deduction, right? Most of us take the standard. And in fact, after the most recent tax bill, it's something like 90 to 95% of folks are taking the standard deduction. So for those folks that give charitably, but aren't giving in really big numbers, big dollar amounts, there is no real deduction benefit for them, right? Because they're still below that standard deduction amount. The CARES Act raised it to 100%. So you have an option where if you have a donor who's having a big income year, whatever's going on in their situation, they could potentially give away up to 100% of their adjusted gross income in the calendar year in cash directly out to a charity and take a full 100% deduction. I don't think we've ever had that before. Previously, it was 60%, I think was the high water mark. So this is very advantageous for the right donor. Okay, and so we're going to have this bill in 2021. Very interesting, but the purpose of this was to get people to give in cash, outright, kind of get the dollars out the door, get them into the hands of people that need them, in response to the pandemic, right? So that's still with us. And then finally, I would say the CARES Act, we did away, remember we talked about RMD. Last year, the CARES Act said no RMD. If you don't want to take your RMD in 2020, you didn't have to. That has now been revoked. So there is going to be an RMD requirement in 2021. So now we have an advantageous, in my opinion, atmosphere where folks who don't want that RMD or don't need the income this year could instead redirect that up to $100,000 directly from their IRA to a qualified public charity. Okay, so that's an advantageous development. that we didn't have just for that last year because of COVID.
And here it is. I just can't get any
All right.
higher volume on it.
Okay. All right. So we're going to leave the short-term legislation for a moment, and we're going to talk just a second about the AFR rate, the applicable federal rate. Sometimes you see it as the 75/20 rate, okay? And what is this? This is an IRS discount rate used to calculate charitable gift deductions for many types of plain gifts. So every month the IRS will publish this rate, and some months it stays the same, some months it goes up or down a little bit, you know. And what this really means for us on this call is, if I'm going to set up a charitable trust that's going to last, you know, I don't know, 25 years, when I'm building that trust, when I'm sort of as the architect of setting up all the terms, one of the terms I need to put in there is sort of a base floor percentage of growth for this trust. And instead of just picking something out of the sky, I go to the IRS, who publishes this every month. I take the rate that they've published, I plug it into my document, and now I have something that's sort of the minimum the IRS is saying this trust needs to grow or will grow in the future. So think of it as sort of a minimum hurdle rate or a minimum hurdle that a charitable trust needs to beat or overperform to be successful long term. So if you think about that, it's probably advantageous in a certain sense to have a very low rate, right? Because it just makes it much more likely, if I have a really good rate of return in the market, that I'll have a great performance of this vehicle. So to that point, the rate right now is 0.6%. I think it got down to 0.4 a few months back when we were really in the throes of COVID. It's ticked up just a tiny bit to 0.6. Historically, very, very low. I don't know if it's ever been this low in anyone since they've even been doing this, at least not that I've seen. So any vehicle that is dependent on a low AFR rate, this is probably the best time and economically to do one of these gifts that probably any of us will ever see in our lifetimes, or hopefully we'll ever see in our lifetimes. Just to give you some context, in January 2009, okay, we were having the Great Recession, or at least we were sort of coming out of it, 2008. That same rate was 2.4%. So on one hand, it shows you probably how bad our economy is, or at least how bad certain segments of it are, compared to even maybe many of us remember that from several years ago. But it shows you also how the right folks, the right situation, how advantageous doing some of these plain gifts is from a tax point of view. All right, so we talked about some shorter term things, some more weather related. This is a little more climate related in the sense that it's a little longer term. This is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, otherwise called the TCJA, easy for me to say, right? This was the big tax bill that was signed in 2017 and came effect in 2018. And again, whole bunch of stuff in there. We had the corporate tax issues, we had the individual lowering of the rates, and all types of things were happening in this bill. The two big things, though, I think that affect donors and certainly affect them in terms of plain giving as well, that came out of this legislation were the doubling of the estate tax exemption and essentially the doubling of the standard deduction, okay? So the one on the left, we're talking estate tax. The one on the right, we're talking more income tax. And we talked about that just a little bit a second ago. So on the estate tax, all of us have a lifetime bucket of dollars that we can give away estate tax free to family members or whoever. Right now, it's as high as it's ever been. It's essentially a little over $11 million per person, or it's more like 23 for a married couple. So if you think about people with estates, right, all of your assets, all of your net worth for a lifetime, anyone who essentially right now who dies with, say a married couple with 23 million or less are not paying any kind of estate tax. or, in general terms. It used to be, before this, it was 5.5 million per person. So essentially doubled. In years past, it was 3. It used to be in the 80s and 90s, I think it was 600,000. So if you think about people that have a net worth of 600,000 versus people that have a net worth of 23 million, a married couple, that's a much bigger pool or lesser pool of people that potentially could be impacted by the estate tax. The reason that matters a whole lot, I think, to plan giving folks is one thing that avoided estate tax, or was a way that if you had really large estate dollars and you didn't, you gave your kids as much money as you could give, or to other family members, if you were still over that amount, one way to avoid some of that tax was to do charitable giving, plan gifts out of your estate. A lot of times people put them in foundations, private family foundations. Some people just made outright gifts out of their estate to charities, but it was a dollar for dollar avoidance of that tax. Very powerful, okay? So an advisor could sit down with Mr. and Mrs. Smith and say, you're gonna have $4 million of estate tax to pay after you die, or you could give $4 million to the United Way in your hometown and essentially, general terms, avoid the estate tax, right? That's a very powerful option, right? People draw onto that. They like that idea versus paying the estate tax, right? Or put it in their family foundation or whatever charitable component. So this doubling of the estate tax sunsets at the end of 2025. This whole legislation, this whole tax legislation sunsets at the end of 2025. So will things change between now and 2025? Who knows, right? But if nothing changes, and what we know is on the books now, is we're going to be dealing with this at least probably for the next, roughly 4 years. All right. The other piece of this, I think, that factors into our charitable giving is our annual standard deduction doubled. So if we had, people that were big givers, they were giving $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 a year, they could give their charitable gift, take an itemized deduction, and realize the benefits, the tax benefits of that charitable giving in any given year that they did it. With the standard deduction being doubled, now people essentially as a married couple are having to give over and above, say, $24,000 a year in charitable gifts to even qualify to itemize. Okay, it just makes, not to say that people don't do it, but it's just maybe a lesser amount of people that are doing it. And one statistic I saw was when they analyzed the data from 2018, the first year this was in effect, the total number of itemizers, I'm not talking charitable, but just itemizers in general, dropped from, say, 30% down to 10%. Okay, that's a huge drop. So 10% of taxpayers are even doing itemized at all. And I saw a statistic that the number of people claiming a charitable deduction on their tax return dropped from 24% to 9%. Okay, that's a huge drop in one tax year. Okay, so that's a factor. We're dealing with it right now. It doesn't mean people aren't going to give, but it just means that the sort of dollars and cents rationale is maybe not as compelling in any given year as it might have been before. Okay, just something to consider. Let's see, where am I? Okay, so that's, you say to yourself, David, that's very exciting, and we appreciate all this great information. And we're on the edge of our seats. We can't even hardly, no, I'm just kidding. I know this, I know. So let's jump into some vehicles. Okay, so cash. Obviously, cash is always great. But remember, a few minutes ago, we talked about the CARES Act, or at least the extender of the CARES Act for 2021. Still a big benefit for large gifts of cash, up to 100% of people's adjusted gross income for the right donor. Still in effect. Obviously, cash is great. Go for it. Corollary to that, I don't have it on here, gifts of stock. So if someone has highly appreciated publicly traded stock, so Johnson & Johnson or Amazon or Apple, that stock might have an inborn or whatever ingrained tax disadvantage if the donor sold it They would realize a capital gain. They'd have to pay capital gain tax on that. Instead, if your charity has a brokerage account of some kind to receive gifts of stock directly, they could transfer that stock directly to your charity, get face value credit for the date of the transfer, whatever it's worth, avoid the capital gain, and still, potentially take the deduction for whatever it was worth when they gave it to you. So gifts of stock are still great. Markets up, worth talking to your donors about that. The other vehicle I'm sure some of you have encountered, which continue to be attractive, are donor advised funds. Okay, so we have a community foundation here, right? So community foundations, I think, invented the idea of a donor advised fund. Very advantageous vehicle for your average donor. Relatively easy to set up. They are kind of a alternative to a family foundation or private foundation, which were very popular years ago. These are much more turnkey, less or no overhead, lots of great tax advantages for donors, a lot of flexibility. Nothing really has changed with donor advised funds based on the legislation we discussed, but just for lots of reasons. They're very convenient, very popular. Can be a little tricky for charities dealing with them because you don't always know, you might not know who the dollars are coming from, right? So you could set up a donor advised fund with a very generic name, right? I could be a donor and name it, the Oak Tree Fund or whatever, and then the dollars would come from whoever the organization that runs the donor advised fund. The check would come from them. So sometimes it can be a little tricky tracking down who the actual donor or the family is behind that money. That doesn't happen too often, but if you're not comfortable with donor advised funds or feel like you need to kind of look into them a little more, those are definitely worth the time. They're going to be popular for probably the foreseeable future. The next on the hit parade here is our bequests. Again, nothing magical about them. Nothing really has changed. They're probably the most common plan giving vehicle year in and year out. They can be very simple. I hereby give $100,000 out of my will to the Humane Society, or it can be all types of restrictions and contingencies, and I'll give you the money, but you have to put it in an endowment, and all types of things can be in here. But bequests are the bread and butter of a plan giving program. They're very, very important. So, if you're only going to talk to a donor, that great donor, about a couple things, getting named in a will or a trust as a bequest is a great way to go. And hopefully more and more people are doing that as they're doing their estate planning. The last two here, again, these are very big topics, but I felt I should probably at least mention them to you so you're aware of them. One is the charitable lead trust. Okay, so the charitable lead trust is an irrevocable gift, right? It's a standalone trust that the donor sets up, and essentially they donate money into this trust. The trust pays out year over year all the income or whatever the percentage that they set, say 5% of the value of the trust, every year to charity. The charity has the lead interest, the first interest, and for a set number of years. So say they set up for 25 years. For 25 years, the charities named in that trust are going to get, say, 5% every year. And then at the end of that 25 years, or whatever the term might be, whatever's remaining in that trust goes to my grandkids, for example. So it's kind of like a foundation that goes away at a set time. With the low AFR rate, remember we talking about the 0.6%, basically the IRS is saying, we think your trust will make 0.6%. Any growth above 0.6% is essentially going to transfer out tax-free at the end of the line. So you hope, your portfolio of investments is going to perform relatively well. Say you're making, 7% return over the lifetime. You're paying out 5% a year to the charities. The IRS tax on that 0.6. Potentially you have some growth at the end that could go to your grandkids tax-free. Very powerful vehicle, primarily used to avoid estate tax, but could be used to avoid income tax. If you see somebody with one of these or that talked about one of these, very sophisticated, generally very high net worth person, you want to be in as many of these, hopefully as you can be. But people are doing them right now, very advantageous for the right donor under the circumstances we're in. The final one here is a chair remainder trust. This is a more common, I think there are more of these out there than charitable lead trusts, or at least historically there were. The AFR rate doesn't really work to the advantage of these. They're kind of the inverse. So this is a donor puts money, or puts assets in a trust. The donor takes back the annual payment for the 5% a year for 20 years, or for their life, or the life of them and their spouse, whatever. And then at the end, whatever's left, the remaining part, the charity gets at the end, will go out to the charity. Still advantageous for folks. People maybe don't need as much assets to get one of these off the ground. They can also be coupled with an IRA to avoid that stretch IRA provision, the 10-year provision we mentioned. But these are going to be your most common, probably going from sort of left to right. At least the first three are going to be the most common. The last two on the right, might not see them every day, but worth knowing, at least knowing the term and kind of making sure you have that straight in your mind. So I'll leave it there, and then hopefully we'll have some comments and discussion here in a few minutes, just a couple more slides to work through here. So everything we've talked about so far has been sort of the technical or the head, people give from the head or the heart, right? Or a combination of two, maybe plain giving donors might weave those two, right? There's a rationale, there's a logical reason to give this asset at this time, but there's also sort of the heartstring aspect, right? Of why people give and what organizations they really identify with. And that doesn't change at all with plain giving, right? It's the same concepts of building a relationship, connecting with a donor, connecting with the mission of your organization. All the same factors apply. Plain giving, there's nothing really different. One thing we get in the context of this, though, is what can we do in the meantime? And the we being folks on the phone, right? People working at charities. We're going to be talking with donors tomorrow. What are some things we can hopefully think about, learn, maybe implement? One thing I start out with, and I work with clients who are, they're my clients, but they're donors to somebody else, is one thing I talk to them about is take an inventory of your values. That's what I say to my clients or donors. And I really think of in terms of what is the money supposed to do, right? We are in a time where people they're at home and they're thinking about what's important to them. They're thinking about their goals in life, right? They're thinking about potentially their goals for when they're gone, right? So, to the extent that you can have a conversation with a donor, or if a donor's talking about these types of things, these are not tax-related items, right? These are what's important to me as a person, what change do I want to see in the world, where can I move the needle, me, one donor, or a group or a family. We have a lot of causes that we're interested in, or we've been interested in the past. But boy, we focused on one or two things in our community with the limited amount of dollars we have, which might be significant, but still limited. Where can we move the needle? Where can we see our values brought to life, manifest out in the real world through your organization, right? Sometimes I talk about, when I teach a longer plain giving class, I talk about there's a real need for people, a human need to be remembered, right? We have this sort of, evolutionary kind of thing where we want to be remembered after we're gone, right? Cavemen used to paint their hands on the wall of the cave or what have you, right? We want to see something that resonates after we're gone. And one of those things, might be the work of your organization, and it might be my financial support to your organization, and your organization remembering me, maybe a name on a building, maybe the name on a program, whatever it might be, whatever makes sense. That's going to continue on potentially if they're doing endowment giving forever. Okay, that's a big kind of meaty topic there. And the more you can weave your organization, I think, and your mission into that thinking of the values. People are having life events, right? We used to talk about life events are like, okay, marriage, a death, a new grandchild, a wealth event, right? Selling a business or hitting the lotto or whatever. Those are all life events, but they all happened periodically in different people's lives at different times, right? So not everybody was getting married at the same time, right? Well, with COVID, we're all kind of dealing with a life event, all of us at the same time in the same place, which is kind of not very common if you think about it, right? So I've noticed with my clients, people are at home and they're thinking about stuff and they're talking about stuff and they're pulling out the estate plan they did 20 years ago that they never thought much about. And they're thinking about the future of their family and they're thinking about the future of their communities. And, you know, a lot of times we talk about plain giving with donors and it's all well and good. And you might have a donor that's very receptive to your statements. But if they're not going to go open their estate plan or go work with their attorney to kind of change something, then you're not going to get a plain gift, right? There needs to be some action, some spurring for folks to actually go and do something to make sure that that plain gift actually gets completed. And that kind of stuff is happening right now because of the circumstances we're in. So don't, I guess I say that to the Senate, don't let this opportunity, even though it's a pandemic, it's also could be an opportunity to have some very meaningful, serious conversations. The other thing I'd throw out there, and these are just sort of not in any particular order, but just sort of a laundry list of things. Consider endowment, you know, right? So we talked about earlier about cash gifts out the door, out there in the community, doing good right now. The inverse of that is an endowment, right? And so we think about legacy. We think about what's going to happen after I'm gone. Me and my family have passed on. An endowment might be my legacy, right? It might be something that lives on at the community foundation or with your organization or what have you. And we'll be doing whatever it is, my mission or whatever I want to see happen in the world, year after year, potentially forever. One way I think to think about that too is, you know, if you all have loyal annual givers, giving 1,000, 5,000, whatever, that are very close to you, and you can count on those gifts, and they're going to be there year in, year out, or maybe they're increasing their gift year after year, or what have you. We can guarantee that those people are not going to live forever. Okay, so if you have a $5,000 donor every year that is, you know, make or break for your organization, the idea of that 5,000 disappearing in 1 year when that person passes and having to fill that gap can be very daunting, right? So thinking about those donors, of those ones that are very, very close to you and your organization, one way is maybe consider them creating an endowment that spins off annually that same amount of money they've been giving to you out of their checkbook, right? So that they're always there with you. They're always supporting the mission. You don't have to scramble. You don't have to, you know, get $5,000 donors to make up to that one $5,000, right? Just an idea of thinking about, you know, how endowment plays in, plain giving could play in with your annual fund. That could be powerful for the right donor. The other thing I would throw out there is review your organization's 990, right? I work with, you know, some folks, they haven't looked at it or they don't even know what's in there. There's all types of stuff in there, right? And the trend, I think, is the IRS is requiring more disclosure. There's more questions, there's more detail that's coming out on these things, with the idea that the IRS can't police charities the way maybe they should, but at least they can make you disclose things publicly so that donors are on notice. They can go pull the 990 whenever they want, read through it with, you know, see how your organization's doing, how much endowment you have, how much you spend, how much you take in, all types of stuff in there. So, you know, if you're working at a charity and maybe it's been a little while since you looked at your last 990, maybe pull it out, get really comfortable with it. Maybe there's some things in there you can spin as a very positive thing for your organization. Maybe your numbers are trending in the right way, or you're increasing support or what have you. It can be very much a marketing item. There might be some things that aren't so great in there, but at least you might be ready for them, or at least have some data around what's happening. Because a lot of these plain giving donors are going to kick your tires and they're going to want to dig in. And so might as well be ready for it with the data that's out there publicly anyway, right? And then finally, I'll just leave you with, okay, we're looking at 990, right? That's a snapshot. It's past tense, right? Usually there's some delay. How's next year going to look? How's the next filing going to look? I mean, I know you don't know exactly, but are things trending in the wrong way? Have things stabilized? Have you discovered something you tried out in your organization that is really getting traction that you can kind of weave into your next message, your next appeal to donors? Just trying to think ahead. Donors want to know, right? They want to know who needs what, who's having the most impact, how is COVID affecting you, right? I mean, I think for especially the donors that are closest to you, this is a time of transparency, and I think this is a time of being proactive to the best you can. So just throwing that out there. The last thing I'll leave you with, this was a blog post that came out. This is the National Association of Charitable Gift Planners, which is it's kind of like AFP, but for plan giving, national organization. They have some really great materials. They have a great conference every year. They put out this blog post May 5th, so knee deep in the COVID pandemic, and not a long blog post, but it's talking about essentially in a much more eloquent way than I am how much plan giving is going to be a factor in the health and the vibrancy of charities going forward. And there's lots of good data points in there. There's some data points in there you might use with your board or your senior leadership. Certainly some good planning, some good data points to use with the right donors. Not a long post, but certainly if you're at all interested, pull it up, read it through. Really good resource overall. And with that, we will switch to any questions or comments or discussion.
David, excellent.
All right, John, how'd we do? That's 12:45 on the dot, John.
You did good. Yeah. We will end right on time, but we've got a 15-minute window here. And I've got a question that came in immediately here. Plan giving conversations are very personal, and I've always done them face-to-face. In today's day and age, any suggestions for making a phone call or Zoom seem more personal when talking about plan gifts?
Well, certainly, a lot of our folks, and I've seen this with my clients, right? So generally speaking, most plan giving prospects skew older, not necessarily always the case, but if you think about, we're giving potentially out of asset pools generally take a lot of time to accumulate, and generally that skews to an older demographic of donor. One thing that we've noticed is a lot of our older clients don't really want to meet face-to-face, right? They'd rather not take the risk. So to the extent maybe they are savvy with Zoom, we certainly offer it. Some folks would rather just have a phone call, but I don't think there's any right way to do it other than being available, right? So a lot of folks are in their house, right? So just having that connection, maybe instead of one phone call, you have a couple, right? You kind of weave in, maybe you spend a little more time talking about what's happening in the organization. Certainly sending any materials ahead or afterwards, hard copies in the mail, or if they're email savvy, using that. But yeah, I don't have any tips other than being available, maybe being more available than you would have in the past, and really kind of using that time to strengthen the relationship and not harp maybe so much on the technical stuff. But certainly, I tell folks when we do presentations like this is a good excuse, right? You can say, oh, I was just on this webinar. There was some guy named David. I don't know. He was talking about a bunch of boring stuff, but he was talking about plan giving. And we're talking about that internally. And I don't know, what do you think about it, Mr. and Mrs. Donor? Or have you heard anything recently about it? Or did you have any questions, right? And just making it very kind of, soft, conversational interaction usually is the best way to go.
Great. One other question, and that has to do with we live hand to mouth and don't see that we have the luxury to ask somebody for a gift that we're not going to get for months or even years. Should we really start a plan giving program? What do you say to that?
Well, I think, sometimes when you say the plan giving program, it conjures up an image of, there's going to be this huge outlay of resources and staff time, and you're going to have to build a website or buy software or totally change your plan. And that doesn't, that's not really a realistic idea for a lot of folks. So I think there's a strong correlation, and there's some data points out there between annual giving and planned giving. So if you're thinking, okay, we're harping on annual giving, we're out there, we're calling on our most loyal donors, we're trying to get people from $500 to $1,000 or what have you. Planned giving is all about quality over quantity. So if you can think about can we pull a spreadsheet or can we pull a list of our most loyal annual givers, the folks that keep the lights on, the folks that give us year in and year out, and you have that list in front of you. And then maybe if you can show who's given us the most in their lifetime, right? Or who's given us the most consecutively without ever missing a year. There's a lot of data that says if folks give you 8 years in a row or more with never missing an annual check, those are probably your most likely planned giving donors, right? Because what we're looking for is we're looking for measurements of affinity, measurements of passion for your organization. It's hard to measure that. We can always measure dollars. We can measure, oh, they have a house that's worth this, or they have a boat or whatever. You know, Warren Buffett has the most dollars of any of us, right? But how do we measure if Warren Buffett likes your organization and is engaged with your organization? And those are all qualitative factors, right? Do they come to your events, or do they come to all your Zoom calls? Do they give each and every year without missing a year? Or maybe they've increased every year. They started out a $50 donor and now they're at a $250 donor. Or like I said, if you can pull a list of who's giving you the most lifetime. All those things are trying to measure affinity or passion for your organization. So if you're going to call on those people anyway, and they're the most important to your organization anyway from an annual point of view, weaving in a planned giving thought or conversation. Sometimes on the annual appeal card, there'll be a little box that says, have you included us in your will? Or would you like to talk about a planned gift? Just a little box, right? It says, you know, $50, $100, $250, you know, have you included us in your planned giving? And if you get 2 people to check that box, those are your 2 people that are, you know, glowing on the radar screen of high affinity for you. So yeah, do you have to create a whole program and dedicate others? No, probably not, and probably won't be able to. But are those the 2 people maybe that you should call on a little more, invite to more things, offer to take the coffee or lunch more regularly? Yeah, I think that's showing you those are the folks that keep close to you. And to the extent that you get comfortable weaving in a planned giving conversation, the better, right? So you know maybe there's a small group to spend that energy on.
Very good. We have other questions coming in. Caitlin.
Sure. So David, I wanted to ask you, since you work with the National Plan Giving Association, and you've, I'm sure, seen things in conferences for nonprofits that are smaller, that don't have the capacity to focus on this year round, are there any specific marketing or promotional strategies that you've seen that have worked very well to grab the right audience, to pull in the people that would, you know, be the right donors for plan giving?
Yeah, so I mean, there's different ways. I mean, obviously the community foundation, just generally, community foundations are sort of local plan giving experts or vehicles just by the nature of what they are. So to the extent you can leverage that expertise, there's all types of stuff out there, right? There's groups that are sort of marketing companies that, you know, charge and they can create things for you. There's all types of continuing ed out there. There's the National Association of Charitable Gift Planners is a good place to start. They're that group I mentioned. They have all types of materials that you can access. I don't know, some of them are free, some you might have to pay the membership fee to get into. But I think, you know, I guess my overall point is you don't have to be the plan giving expert yourself. And probably you shouldn't be the plan giving. You shouldn't be the technical expert, right? That's not your role as a charitable, you know, fundraising officer, executive director, or whatever your role is. You know, there are advisors in the community, right? So the donor probably has their own advisors that they deal with just because they have a relationship. You might have folks on your board who have some expertise, financial planners or attorneys or CPAs or what have you, who could be that sort of somewhat of an in-house resource for you. But I think the ask, if there is an ask in a plan gift, is not, I represent charity X, I'm having lunch with donor Mrs. Smith, and I need to start telling her about taxes and legislation and trusts and all this stuff. I don't think that's the way to go. I think the way to go is strengthen the relationship, keep them very close to you, treat them as a special group, right? We're going to try to narrow down our donor pool to some of those factors we mentioned, and just suggest the idea or just ask them. I mean, there's some data points where they've done some surveys and huge numbers of people say, nobody ever asked me. I've done a plan gift. And they say, well, did you tell the charity? Well, no. Well, why didn't you tell them? Well, the number one answer is it's none of their business, which, okay, there's privacy. A lot of people aren't going to tell you, fine. But there's a huge chunk, maybe, 1 in 4, 1 in 3, who say, well, nobody ever asked me. I tell them, but that never came up in the conversation, right? So you say, again, it could be something very innocuous like, oh, I've been doing this continuing ed webinar on plan giving. Have you thought about that? Or, the community foundation is going to do a presentation on year-end tax planning or something to that effect, or we're going to have some board members do a webinar on changes in the legislation. Would you like to come to this, Mr. Smith? Or would you like me to send you the materials or, set up some kind of conversation after? I don't think it's got to be, I think one thing is people feel sometimes it's a very daunting subject. They feel they need to have all this expertise before they even bring it up. I get it. I understand it. I don't know if that is quite necessary. Again, it's not a mass appeal. It's not a scatter shot. We're going to send this message out and we're going to bring this up with everybody. It's a qualitative, right? We're going to get to this core group of our supporters. We know them. They love us. We already get in touch with them all the time. And we're going to try to think about ways that weave this message in based on our situation, our circumstances.
Good. Caitlin, I've got a couple more. Does that answer your question?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Okay.
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, David,
Yeah.
a bit of a leading question, but one of the things that has come up, and this is about donor confidence and worry and about ripoffs and scams, that was stated that having a plan giving vehicle, a mechanism within your nonprofit's overall resource development plan can build donor confidence, even though they may not want to necessarily set up a planned gift. To see that you even have that says, gee, this is a nonprofit that's a little more sophisticated, it's a little more mature, and maybe it's down the road they do that. But what are your thoughts about how that kind of positions you as a nonprofit, small as you may be, to even at least have that option on your pledge card or on your website?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of times this comes up with, in the context of a conversation around endowment, right? So a lot of organizations don't have endowment. They're kind of just keeping the lights on year to year, haven't really gotten to that point. The reason, not every plan gift becomes endowment, but a lot of them do. There's a really strong correlation. So typically, folks will lean on the community foundation to either hold the endowment for that organization or create a donor advised fund. The donor creates one there that will then, in perpetuity, send out gifts to the charity or what have you. But typically, and again, this gets into the 990 conversation, I've seen it where we had an organization we were working with who didn't have an endowment, but they, at the board level, they wanted to convey that sophistication. They wanted to take the next step in their fundraising. So they had a small reserve fund that they had built up over time. That was just really a rainy day fund. They'd had some different events in the past. And at the board level, they decided to create an endowment themselves, which isn't really true endowment because the board could undo that anytime. But they took that step from a donor relations point of view for the purpose of conveying that confidence and hopefully inspiring donors to actually give new endowment gifts as well to the organization, right? So they were just in a situation where their financial situation allowed for that. Sometimes, a lot of times you get a gift and a bequest out of someone's will you didn't know anything about. And it just floats in, right? And it says, hey, I will give your organization $500,000, but you have to put it in an endowment and you can only use, the income for operations or what have you. And you might not have an endowment and you might not even have been thinking about that, but here we are, a gift floats in from the outside. What do we do? Well, some organizations will scramble and try to set up a program, and the CFO or whoever's doing the books will try to get that happening. Some folks will go to the community foundation who has that expertise, and the gift will go there and they'll manage the endowment on behalf of the charity.
Can I get
But so as you're getting
amen on that, David? Come to the local foundation, because that's something her foundation does. That's a great setup. Go ahead. Excuse me for interrupting. We're about to wrap up. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean that's one of the reasons community foundations, that's one of the purposes they serve. They're sort of an independent endowment. And I sit on the board of my community foundation here in Florida, Central Florida, and we've seen that happen, right? So basically, you're not going to know even the majority of plain gifts, right? Hopefully people have created them for your organization. They don't have to tell you. Even if they tell you, some of them are revocable. They could change it and not tell you or whatever. So you're hopefully going to have a situation where someone has left you in their will or trust, and you have to, as an organization, have to decide, can we handle this gift?
Gotcha.
Literally, can we handle in the sense of, can we manage it, steward it, invest it, what have you? Or can we handle if there's a restriction on it? Donors love to put restrictions, right? I will give you this money, but you can only use it for, XYZ program.
Understood.
Right?
Okay.
You might not have that program anymore, or you might be sunsetting that program or what have you. So you have to it's very literal, right? Can we handle this gift? Can we do what the donor wants us to do? So I would say, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Contact Caitlin, right? Good.
Yeah, that's right. That's the short answer.
Thank you, David. Thanks all for the call.
All
We're
right.
right at our stopping time. One of the keys to successful meetings,
Yes.
start on time and end on time. David, thanks again. Caitlin, I'll toss
Absolutely.
it back to you to bring us home.
Thank you, John. And thank you so much, David. We really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise with us today. For those who hopped on in the middle of the call there, we did record the full session. And as soon as we retrieve that recording, we will be sending it out to our full mailing list. So you can feel free to share that with your colleagues and board. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We hope you have a great day and see you again soon at our next MPO Connect.